document is not in that order, so just keep with me. But Professor Hairston, who is going to be moderating our event today, is a professor lecturer in journalism at GW. He worked at the Washington Post for 23 years as a beat reporter, investigative reporter, editor, and senior newsroom manager, including as deputy national editor and metropolitan editor. As a reporter for the Post, he twice was recognized for his journalism excellence as a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize. Keith has spoken on media relations at the National Academies, the Justice Department, police training academies, and other government agencies and professional associations. He has been a frequent guest on WHUR-FM's Reporters Roundtable segment of the Daily Drums news program. He's also on the editorial board for the nonprofit Spotlight DC, which funds and produces investigative journalism focused on the local DC area. Professor Harrison is co-author of Say Their Names, How Black Lives Came to Matter in America by Grand Central Publishing, October 2021. So thank you so much for being here and moderating our event today. Professor Holland, who didn't remember when I took class with him 2 semesters ago, but it's okay, is an award-winning writer, journalist, and television personality. He guest hosts the Sunday edition of C-SPAN's Washington Journal and is an opinion columnist for MSNBC.com. Professor Holland was a longtime race and ethnicity writer for the Associated Press, as well as serving as a White House, Supreme Court, and congressional reporter. During his 2 decades in the nation's capital, he was one of the few journalists to be a credentialed member of all 3 members of the major Washington press corps. He's also a noted author, having written Black Men Built the Capitol, Discovering African American History in and Around Washington, D.C., and The Invisibles, Untold Stories of African American Slaves in the White House. He also authored The Black Panther, Who is a Black Panther novel, and edited the Black Panther Tales of Wakanda anthology for Marvel and Titan Books. He is currently working on a Captain America Sam Wilson anthology from Marvel and the nonfiction story of an African American slave town here in the Washington D.C. area. Professor Holland is also working on his first documentary based on the book The Invisibles. So welcome, Professor Holland, to our panel. Professor Thompson is an associate professor in SMPA and the senior editor for NPR's Member Stations Investigations. Before moving to NPR in 2019, she spent 22 years as an investigative and beat reporter with the Washington Post. Her work has prompted policy changes in state and federal investigations that resulted in the conviction of several elected and appointed officials. Professor Thompson has won more than 40 regional and national investigative awards, including an Emmy, 3 NABJ awards, 2 IRE awards, and 3 national headliners. She was also part of the Washington Post team that won the Pulitzer Prize for national reporting in 2002 and 2016. She served as the investigative reporting coach for the NPR podcast No Compromise that won the 2021 Pulitzer Prize for audio reporting. She also served as a juror for the 2022 Pulitzer Prizes in the investigative reporting category. In 2018, Professor Thompson was elected the first Black president of Investigative Reporters and Editors, a 6,000-member organization dedicated to improving investigative journalism. She served 3 terms in that role and was elected board member chair in June 2021. Thompson was also named NABJ's Educator of the Year in 2017, and she is also a faculty advisor for GW's chapter of Association of Black Journalists. Welcome, Professor Thompson. And then, last but not least of our professors, Professor Cheers is a cultural curator, associate professor of digital storytelling, and the director of academic adventures for Planet Forward at GW. Dr. Cheers received her BFA from Washington U in St. Louis and an MA in African Studies and a PhD in Mass Communication and Media Studies from Howard University. Dr. Cheers is an award-winning digital storyteller, director, producer, and filmmaker. As a professor of practice, she uses a variety of mediums, including video, photography, television, and film, to document and discuss issues impacting and involving people of the African diaspora. Her scholarly focus is on the intersection of women and girls, technology, health, conflict, agriculture, and the effects of climate change in sub-Saharan Africa. Professor Cheers is also an expert on diversity in Hollywood, specifically the representation of Black women in television and film. She is the author of The Evolution of Black Women in Television, Mammies, Matriarchs, and Mistresses. Her work has been supported by the Ford Foundation and the International Reporting Project. Dr. Cheers is also a regular contributor for international outlets including BBC, CGTN America, and CTN Canada, offering insight into American race relations and popular culture. In 2017, she was awarded GW's Graduate Mentoring Award, and in 2019, the Staub Excellence in Teaching Award. So thank you, Professor Cheers, for being here as well. And then last but not least, We have two really awesome GW and GW-ABJ alumni joining us today. The first is Devin Cole. Devin, a GW alum, is a CNN Politics breaking news reporter covering legal affairs in Washington, D.C. Cole has reported on a range of legal stories, including the Supreme Court's efforts to roll back reproductive and LGBTQ rights. Prior to joining CNN Justice Team, Cole was a general assignment breaking news reporter for the network and reported on some of the biggest stories of the last few years, including the Capitol insurrection, the deaths of Justice RBG, and Colin Powell on the 2020 election. So thank you, Devin, for being here as well. And Adam Middleton is a communications professional and writer who has spent the past decade telling stories about causes such as climate change, human-centered AI, and empowering young men of color. He currently works as a digital director for MCSR and previously was a content strategist at Connections Media and Outcast and the social media and engagement lead for the My Brothers Keeper Alliance at the Obama Foundation. Adam graduated from the George Washington University with a BA in journalism and mass communication, and he served as editor-in-chief of the Black Ace magazine, a student-run publication dedicated to Black students and students of color. After becoming an alumnus, Adam returned to GW to join the School of Media and Public Affairs Diversity and Inclusion Task Force and is a proud member of the GW Loyal Donor Society, and we're so excited to have you here back on our panel today. Yes. So with all that being said, welcoming all of our wonderful panelists, I'll turn it back over to Professor Harrison. Come this way so I don't interrupt it.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, well, let's get right to it. We got about 30 questions ahead of time, pre-taping. I think this has been being videotaped. I tried to whittle them down. I did whittle them down to 10. But so we still have so that means we have another 20 questions that we can fall back on. And maybe, depending upon how time runs, we can reach out to you all if you have any questions that we didn't ask. We're going to start with Adam on this first one. I think everybody probably should answer this one, and that is, what is the one thing that you wish Black journalism students knew before going into the field?
Well, good evening, and thank you for having us. Thank you, Ella. Thank you, GW-ABJ. Thank you all for being here. I would say that, and I would say this to any Black young professional in the field, but I think journalism and storytelling especially, your difference is not merely, you're not to be measured based on your ability to assimilate, but to collaborate and to commingle, to be there on purpose. And when I talk about being on purpose as a member of an underrepresented community such as a Black young professional, finding those opportunities to be Black on purpose as well as on accent. What I mean by on purpose is finding those bold moments to be the underheard voice in the room, to peek behind the corner or give the angle that someone doesn't hear, but also not to set yourself up and be in a position where you're representing the entire community, but rather being Black on accident, meaning just speaking from your heart, understanding your experience, and knowing that that is a representation of being Black in your profession, rather than trying to speak for the entire community.
Thank you, and thanks for having me today. It's good to be back with GW-ABJ as a former member myself. I think the one thing that comes to mind is just being like hyper aware of your involvement in various things before you get into the industry. I think especially being on a campus that's so politically active, like trying to remember that even though you want to jump into some of these activities around activism, especially pertaining to being Black on campus or any other sort of like political affiliations you might have, just kind of being aware of like the fact that can come back perhaps and bite you in the wrong way. And so just being really deliberate about every decision you make and remembering that, even though the career seems like it's, 4 or 5 years away, people could look back at what you did in college and say, well, this might impact the way that they report. So obviously, as we kind of talk about objectivity tonight, that'll come up. But just being hyper aware of what you're doing on campus and elsewhere.
Cheryl?
Well, I'm going to have a different perspective. Being a little older than Adam and Devin, I think there are two things that you need to be aware of. One is how hard you have to work, right? I mean, it's like, don't go into this business thinking that it's really easy, because it's really hard. And you need to know that also that writing matters, and grades don't matter. Once you get out of the university, nobody cares whether you got an A in investigative reporting except me. And if you got one from me, you earned it, okay? But it's really about the writing and working hard, and also, finding someone early on. Like, think about mentoring and who can mentor you and help navigate that path, because it's really important. I wish I had known that early on instead of just jumping into, a job and going, what am I doing? And I learned it quickly, though, that every newspaper I worked for, and I worked in Florida and California and Chicago and Kansas City before coming to the Post, and every place as I moved along, I always found somebody in that newsroom who would mentor me and make sure it's always somebody who's well respected and somebody who works hard.
That's great. Thank you for my colleagues and everyone else being here. Thank you so much. And I think also to go with that, Professor Harrison, I think it's really important, yes, for young Black journalists and journalists of color and BIPOC and everyone. But I think that what I want to bring to this conversation is also the importance of speaking to our allies and our advocates on behalf of us. So a lot of times in these morning meetings and these places, that what we'll find is that we, Black women in particular, we're one of few in that room. And so it's so important to have colleagues who also identify and understand the struggle. And it's not a matter of like the social media advocacy, but wanting you all to really understand the importance of showing up as an accomplice, not necessarily an ally and advocate, but like you are willing to also possibly jeopardize your status in the room to also advocate for the story that I'm pitching that is a good story. And then you can help and contribute, and you can provide perspective from your own lived experiences that also enhances the work that I'm doing. So for young Black journalists in the industry, in the field, I want you to find those advocates. Find the allies and the individuals who are also going to advance your work forward, because what I've seen in 20 plus years of being in the industry is that it takes a lot more than my voice to be heard. And my voice can only be heard when it is also championed by my colleagues who acknowledge that that voice is also accurate, but they are the amazing allies that can push that to the forefront.
The great thing about being at the end of the panel is you get to hear everybody else's great answers. But the sucky thing is that they took everything I was going to say. But no, in all seriousness, the thing that I would say most for not only for Black journalists, not only for journalists of color, for all journalists, learn how to walk before you try to run. I come out of the political side of reporting, and we always talk about how there are not enough Black and women journalists covering national politics, but the reason why is because there are not enough Black and women journalists covering mayoral candidates or city hall or county council. And I remember when I was graduating school, I didn't want to go to Des Moines, Iowa for my first job, or Columbia, South Carolina, or Sacramento, California. I didn't want to go to New York and to Atlanta and Miami and Dallas. But to become a political reporter, you're not going to get picked up by a major newspaper to cover a senatorial campaign first. They're going to want to know that you have covered City Hall. You've covered county council. You've covered mayoral races. And there are too many people who want to jump the steps and go straight from college to covering Congress without being willing to go to the smaller towns, learn the craft of political reporting, and then come back and cover something big. It's almost a bit of impatience, and then being angry when you don't get the chance, when you don't have the basic political skills needed to cover the bigger campaigns. We need to learn to use the system that's there and give ourselves the basic skills before we try to jump to the big leagues. Many people just want to jump straight to the big leagues and are frustrated when they can't break in, but don't want to do the smaller steps like covering smaller towns, smaller political races, and then after you've proven your skills, then jump to the big leagues.
Thank you. I'm not going to answer any other questions, but I'm going to answer this one because I can't help it.
And we got some comments on this side too.
Okay. But I would say this. The one thing I would say is this. I get a lot of, especially including GW alums from SMPA, come to my class here to talk to my students. Every one of them talk about finding, life-work balance. But there is no such thing if you're in journalism. The last one who came, I won't mention her name, but she has a really high-profile job at the Washington Post. And she was telling the class how she has found her work-life balance because she was off at Thanksgiving. Even though she did file 2 stories, but she was able to file the 2 stories from her parents' home. And I said to her, you were working. You were working during Thanksgiving. And she said, but for me, that was a balance. At least I could do it from there, and I didn't have to be in the newsroom. But there really isn't this. I guess that the thing I would say is there is no work-life balance if you're going to be in journalism. You as Cheryl said, you got to work hard. And if you don't do that, because there are so few jobs now, you're going to probably not last long, because there are going to be people who will work 7 days a week. Okay? Did you all want to comment some more about that?
Yeah, I want to hear this.
Well, no, I was. No, what I was going to say was I listened to Jesse talk about how the importance of starting off at a small publication, a small station. And it's true because we all came through those ranks. But now I look at the Washington Post and NPR, and they like pluck these kids straight out of college. And I still think it's a mistake. I do. Sorry. I do. Well, that's because I trained you well. Okay. But really, right? Because you got to get that experience of making mistakes. You want to make, because we're all going to make mistakes. You want to make mistakes at a small place where they aren't that noticed, as opposed to at the Washington Post, where everybody notices and you could end your career, But if you've got that experience of a small place where you have somebody who can show you the ropes, I think you're in a much better position. Present company excluded over there.
I will say one thing to that: take the time off. Do not your job will replace you so quickly. If there is one thing that I respect so much about your generation, that my generation, my parents and their parents didn't understand, take your time. Take your time. Your mental health, your work, your desire. The industry that you will sacrifice for will not sacrifice for you.
100%. Amen.
And I left 1,018 hours of sick leave on the table when I left the Washington Post. 1,000. Kick me now. Because I didn't get paid for it. Because I never took a sick day. I never took a sick day.
Always looking for the story.
Exactly. Don't do it.
Don't do that.
Okay, you hear them saying don't do it. Successful, 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 successful. Okay, let's go with Devin next. The next question. What's the most rewarding aspect of working in journalism?
Yeah, is this on? I don't.
It is on.
Is it really on? Okay. I think for me, it's being able to kind of take a step back after the story is finished and hear the feedback that says, "Thank you for taking this like complex topic, this complex story, and breaking it down for an everyday person to understand." And especially as I report on the law in my new job, this is super important, right? Because these issues and concepts are at like a 30,000 foot level, and CNN is our audience is everyday people. I kind of think when I write stories like, can my grandma understand this Supreme Court case and why it's important? Maybe not to her, but to somebody. And so when you finish a story and you get the feedback from colleagues or sources or just people in the public who say, you really broke that down well and explained it, I think that's probably the most rewarding thing for me.
For me, it's knowing that I held people accountable, knowing that you all won't be taken advantage of by somebody who did the wrong thing, right? And putting it out there. That's the most rewarding part for me, is doing a story knowing that I got all the facts, I got all the sides, I was objective, I was fair. I remember the police chief, Ramsey, who now is an analyst on CNN and won't return my calls because he works for you all. I remember he said to me once when I covered DC police, he said, I hate those stories that you write. He said, but you're fair. And to me, that's all I care about, because I don't really care whether you like the story, but I do care that I was fair and objective and balanced.
I teach. I don't. I'm a reformed journalist.
Well, I'm in withdrawal, so I'm only 3 years out of. I'm out. No. I'll tell you that I think I'm out. Okay. Okay, you might get a different answer. My students have heard me say this before, that there are 3 parts to journalism: the researching, the interviewing, and the writing. And everybody doesn't love all 3 parts. I prefer the research and the writing. I hate talking to people. I mean, it's a weird thing for a journalist. That is not the part that I love. I love the research and the writing parts. But I've discovered the reason why I love the research and the writing part is because I'm also a historian. Too much of our history has been lost because no one bothered to write it down. So my favorite stories are always the historical stories, where we're preserving for the record that this happened this way. Because when I do my historian part of my life, the first thing we do is we go look in the newspapers. Absolutely. And that's the story that's being told of what the country was like. And if we as journalists let these stories escape us now, just like in the past, the stories of the slaves of the White House were never written down. And one of the things that I'm working on eventually, this is one of my long-term projects, is to make sure we capture the stories of the Jim Crow South. Because 50 years from now, just like there are Holocaust deniers, there'll be Jim Crow deniers. There'll be people who say that never happened. So for me, what I love so much about journalism is we're capturing the stories now for the future. So we can be able to say this is what it was really like, not what people are making up. We have the quotes, we have the video, we have the audio from the people who lived through it. This is what happened, not the story they're making up now.
We're gonna go to Adam, but you really don't like talking. Oh, you don't like talking to people, but you don't mind talking. Right.
Well, I would tell you what I tell my students, but that's not for this crowd. So.
Thank you. So I'll pivot by saying I'm probably the only person on stage who doesn't really consider themselves a journalist. I like to say that I got my JMC degree and then I started using the MC side, the mass communication side, doing communications and public relations. But you still have the opportunity. What I find most rewarding is shaping the way people experience and remember the news and life, inspiring hope, whether it's, telling the story of how we actually can hit our greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, right? Like all is not lost when it comes to the climate, to inspiring anguish into action. The hardest 3-month period of my career was May 2020 to like August 2020 when I was at the My Brother's Keeper Alliance, and the wave of racial justice protests and the murders of unarmed black people were happening. And we had the challenge of being, the landmark initiative of the president's kind of racial justice legacy, his initiative for young men and boys of color, and trying to tell a story to the country that all of the tragedy and the anguish was real. And there was also an opportunity to leverage action and to take the protests and to join your MBK community, to watch a conversation between activists on all sides of the spectrum about what it is that we can do. And so it shapes the way that people remember the historical record, as Professor Holland said. And so that's really rewarding. Even if you're up at 2 a.m. rehearsing and you're back up at 6 a.m. and your finger is jittery because you have the power to mute or unmute the former president of the United States on Zoom on a conversation that's being streamed to millions, you take that step back and you say, we did it. People on this day feel like there's hope and there's opportunity, even in the midst of some of the deepest, darkest tragedies in our history.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Next question will be, we'll start with Cheryl. The questioner prefaced this by saying, I'm specifically thinking about a story concerning racial justice. And the question is there ever a line between a black journalist being able to cover a story fairly while addressing possible conflict of interest and not being able to cover that story with adequate levels of objectivity? I would strike that objectivity and say fairness instead of objectivity.
So let me make sure I understand that. That doesn't sound like one of my students.
Do you ever find yourself covering a story as a black woman that you feel that you cannot fairly cover that story, report it, and write it?
No, because that's how we're programmed, right? I mean, most things I cover, I have an interest in. Right, I like them. Not always. Let me put it like this: the stories I pitch, I have an interest in. I know at one time there was a story that when the shuttle, y'all are too young to remember, when the shuttle exploded, and it was all about the shuttle tiles, right? The NASA shuttle. And my editor came to me, Jeff Lean, who was over investigations, and he says, I want you to do a story on shuttle tiles. I cannot repeat on camera what I said, but I know that I had absolutely zero interest in covering it. Right? But I had to cover it. That was easier because I didn't have an interest. But when I do have an interest, you just have to step back, right? You just have to remove yourself mentally from it. You could deal with it later, right? There was a kid, when I was working at the Chicago Trib years ago, we did a year-long series on kids under the age of 17, I think, who were killed violently. And I was working one Saturday and a call came in, and this 3-year-old was found dead in his mom's apartment. And I was working, so I got the story. And I thought, this is a 3-year-old kid. This could be my nephew, right? But I still had to cover the story. So I go down and I meet, I find the mom, and I asked someone to take me to the apartment where this kid died. And there was this long flight of steps, and at the top was this yellow tricycle. And I thought, this kid is never going to ride this bike again. And I have to keep it together. And I went in the apartment, did the story, went to the kid's funeral. There was a casket about this long, big enough to hold him at 3. There were maybe 15 people there because he was too young to have friends. And his father had come in. It turns out the mother's boyfriend punched him, and because he was doing something with the television, and that's what killed him. And the father was there, and there was piped in music. And his name was Dion King. I still remember it like it was yesterday, and I still get bothered by it. I wrote that story. I wrote the heck out of that story, right? Maybe because I did care about it, but it was still fair and it was balanced. And I went to bed, and I woke up in the middle of the night, and I sobbed like a baby. And it still bothers me. That kid would be like 30 years old now. And I always wonder what he would have been like, right? But I still covered it fairly, even though I cared about it. Like, it could have been my kid. It could have been my nephew. It could have been anybody. So I think we can do that. I think we can absolutely do that. I think the problem comes when, I don't participate in marches. I don't participate in rallies. I think that's where the problem comes in, is when we sort of cross that line from journalists to activists.
Oh, wow. That's a very interesting segue, because I have spent, I grew up in an activist household. So my father worked for Ebony and Jet magazine for 30 years. My first protest was an anti-apartheid protests in 1986, excuse me. I was 6 years old, and I vividly remember not necessarily understanding the injustice of the moment, but understanding the fervor of the movement around me. I'm very small, and so seeing all of these adults around me passionate on multiple sides of this issue, whether it be in DC and you're blocking traffic on whatever street, or whether you be pro or anti-apartheid, pick your side. But it was very clear to me very early that you can choose. And so I chose. Unbeknownst to me at 6, but in 2023, and what has completely shaped my life has been looking at the way in which journalism, storytelling, and activism can coincide. Not that they should, but they can. And finding a way, in what I'm so proud of, for, as my colleague and I were discussing, our 10 years, our decade. Professor Thompson and I joined SMPA at the exact same time. And so our decade of service to this community is providing the perspectives. And that's what I feel like has been tried to be pit against us. And reality is more of our comparison, and the fact that you can be a part of something that is bigger than yourself, and also objectively provide perspective on that. I saw at 6 years old, and I understood at 6 years old, in a South African concept, but also what I see right now in a 2023 and an Israeli-Palestinian concept, that I fully am constantly anti-apartheid, and I will always be anti-apartheid. And I say that now, and I said that then. And I am proud that we are able to be a part of an industry that understands the ability to be objective, but also to have those opinions to shape the way in which we move our society forward. And I don't apologize for that. My father didn't, my mother didn't, and I don't now. And I think that's a really important viewpoint, and also what I am very proud to be a part of SMPA and what we do.
You're going to notice my answer to this is a little different, but the way I'm going to answer it is, why are black journalists always asked to answer this question? Let me put the question in a different way and see if it makes any sense to anyone. Can a woman journalist fairly cover the issue of abortion? Can a Jewish reporter fairly cover a Jewish candidate running for president? Can a gay reporter fairly cover Pete Buttigieg? If the answer to all the rest of those questions is yes, why are black journalists always asked to justify why we should be able to cover racial justice issues? I consider it almost a trap question that black journalists are always asked to answer, as if we, for some reason, cannot be fair and objective, and every other journalist, no matter what their religious, financial, gender, or sexuality is, they're never asked to answer that question. So why do we as black journalists have to justify our objectivity when we've proven over the years that we can do this? We have been doing this. But and especially being here in Washington as a former race and ethnicity reporter, I've heard that question used against black journalists time and time and time and time again. Oh, she can't write about racial justice because she's black. Well, I mean, can a white reporter write about racial racial justice because they're white? Can women write about women's issues and be fair and objective? So I will tell you, this is one of the questions that it sort of ticks me off a little bit, because I've heard it so many times over my career that people want to question my competency covering the thing that I'm covering. Nobody ever questions whether I can be fair when covering a political issue. Well, people always assume black journalists are Democrats. And so they try to use that as well. But I understand the question wasn't posed in that way. But I will tell you, it's one of the questions I'm personally sick of hearing, because most of the time when I hear it, it's because someone's trying to use the question to cast doubt on a story they didn't like, or to protect a candidate or a corporation or a figure who has done something wrong. And that's the first thing they try to do. They try to discredit the journalists. And if it's a racial justice issue, the first thing they turn to is the reporter's race. And it gets frustrating.
That's Professor Harrison just trying to start something.
No. I included that question specifically hoping that somebody would give that answer. Our friend, a lot of our friends, Kevin Merida, who is now the executive editor of the LA Times, that's the exact answer he gave about 20 years ago when someone asked him, and we were on a panel someplace. And when he's asked that question, he doesn't get as deep as you, he doesn't go on as long. But he essentially,
He don't like to talk.
I know, but he doesn't like to talk. We're going to come back right to you all. But he says, whenever he's asked, he just says, do you ask white reporters that? And if you don't ask me. And he doesn't go any further.
Sure, me or...
I'll be really quick as the non-journalist on the stage. For black communicators, and I'll speak specifically to the students because I agree so much with what Dr. Cheer said about the way that activism and journalism and storytelling are really gelling together. I think especially for our generation, or I have to train myself to start saying your generation. So it's especially in the social media space where I work a lot. You really want to some days say, burn it down, defund, right? Hopefully, especially as you're earlier in career, going back to something Professor Tom said, you have a good mentor editor who can hold you accountable and walk you back or talk you through that approach in a way that will help you next time and develop your voice.
Two things on this. One, the Kevin Merida reference is nice. He actually was just quoted in a piece in the Post by Len Dowding, the former editor of the Post. That's worth reading. It's all about objectivity and biases and how we're kind of working through this now today. But I would say, kind of going off of what Adam said, is like, even with like those ideas in mind of like, well, there might be some sort of suspected bias or whatever, like the guardrails are there, right? Like this is why we have editing processes. This is why, like at CNN, for example, we have a really complex editing process where there are any number of editors. I mean, there could be upwards of 10 editors looking at one story, and hopefully they're there to help pick out those biases or those things that could come out in the actual product that the public might take issue with in this regard. So I don't know, it seems like a very scary kind of, you have to, assess your personality and the way you approach the world before you get into the industry. But like, these organizations have been around for a long time, and they have these processes in place in order to ensure that the reporting isn't all sort of muddied up with people's biases and whatever else. So,
I think I hinted to you all that we might bring this up, but since you brought it up, I think it's a good time to bring it up. And that is, there's a movement in journalism now to looking at what objectivity really means. At the same time that newsrooms are saying we have to broaden broaden the pool of voices that we're listening to determine what a story is and what objectivity is, because the objectivity that we all have come to know and work under was essentially created by one gender and one race. It was white males. They said, this is objective, and if you don't do it this way, you're not objective. And they are now understanding, unfortunately for George Floyd, a lot has to do with his death, so that like a lot of industries, including journalism, are looking at that. But what do you think about, who we want to start with this? Let's start with Devin. Sorry, CNN. But how do you feel about the idea that we should be looking at objectivity differently than we have in the past, and that just because whoever the top ranking editor on any given day for any given story at CNN is in charge, that person generally will determine whether that story is fair and objective. How can we go about really trying to expand the definition of objectivity and expand the pool of people that have voices in newsrooms?
That's a complex one. I think so much of it has to do with just kind of like trying to take apart the idea that objectivity, fairness, and bias is like all people conflate them as one thing, right? And so we can cover stories and perhaps not be 100% objective, right? Because for me, for example, as a gay black man, I'm reporting on an issue, maybe something to do with the LGBTQ community, and the reporting should be informed by my own experience as a gay man, and I should know how to kind of go about sourcing and research and everything based on what I know as a gay person. But that doesn't mean that the reporting is necessarily going to be biased in the direction of, you know, the queer community. And so I think just kind of like trying to dismantle the idea that those things are all connected and can't be pulled apart is key here. But yeah, I mean, I think newsrooms should certainly be taking a look at their standards around objectivity and saying it's okay for your own identities, the intersectionality of them, to play a role in the way that you go about your reporting, so long as it's not coming out in the product in a way that that is not fair to one or the other of the people that it's trying to reach. So.
Oh, you're just gonna skip everybody else. All right. The answer to the question depends on the organization you work for, plus the type of journalism that you're doing. You have to understand that news reporting isn't the only part of journalism. Writing columns are not your only part of journalism. So each job requires something different. As a news reporter, and I may be the old fogey on this, as a news reporter, I should never, by reading your story, find out what you think. In a news story, you should never be able to tell whether the reporter's race, the reporter's political positions, the reporter's gender, because that's not the vehicle for that. If you want to do advocacy with your stories, there are places for that. But the news report isn't that place. So I'm not going to fall in the corner of we need to change what our objectivity standards are. We always need to get more voices into our stories. We do need to get rid of the idea that there are only two sides that need to be in a story, because a story can have 8 different sides. And that's one of the old maxims of journalism that I really wish we could get rid of, that a story should have 2 sides. In the past, the story only had 2 sides because they only talked to one community. Now we should know better. But that doesn't mean we throw away the idea of, for a news reporter, what you're providing is the information. And the reader, the viewer, the listener can make up their mind about what they think on the topic. Now, I write columns now. That's not my job now. My job is to tell you what you think and why you're wrong and I'm right. That's what I do for a living now. But as a news reporter, I should never be able to figure out what your stance is. The way I found out that I was doing my job correctly was when I got let's call it what it was, hate mail from a reader who assumed I was white. Because they couldn't tell they hated the story I wrote, but they couldn't tell through the story that I was a black man. They thought I was a white female. writing the story. That's what I think we're going for. We're going for you using your skills as a reporter to provide the information to your readers, listeners, viewers. But your personal opinion should never appear in the story anywhere. Or you're writing a column. And it needs to be moved to a different section of the paper, or it's in a different part of the broadcast.
I teach advocacy journalism, and I believe that your opinion should be in everything. So, but I'm gonna just pass along to my.
There is place for that.
There's a place for that. Come to my classes. That's where it's.
So for me, I think it comes down, objectivity comes down to more than one thing, but one thing, diversity. When you have diverse voices, objectivity is going to follow, because it is no longer just one race and one gender, right? Which is why it's important in this business for you to speak up when you get in a newsroom, pick your battles, but and use your advantage as a journalist of color. That's an advantage, right? Use it. It is, people always ask me, how come there aren't more black investigative journalists? I don't know. You have to ask the white men who are running the organizations, right? Because they're the ones who don't hire us, right? But it's my job, now that I'm in a role, to bring on more people who look like me, so that that objectivity is there front and center all the time.
Right.
Let me add something in just on the end.
And they never thought I was, a white I'm like, wow, a white man.
I wish someone would think I was a white man for one day when I'm doing my taxes.
The thing that Cheryl said that I want to emphasize is pick your battles, because you will find out at whatever job you are at that you're going to be fighting the same fight not only every day, almost every hour. And you'll burn out within the first 2 weeks of trying to correct every injustice, every microaggression that comes toward you. You can't fight everything and still do your job. But there are some times, and you'll learn to recognize. I wish I could say that there's a handy dandy chart I can give you to say this is the one you fight versus this is the one you let go. There will come a time where you are going to have to stand up and say, no, we can't do this. No, this can't be written this way. No, we are not going to just use this B-roll. There are going to be times where you're going to have to say that I'm going to speak up and I don't care what the reaction's going to be. You'll know it when you see it. But you also have to realize that you're going to have to let a lot of stuff go by before that one thing happens. And it's going to frustrate you. It can drive you to drink. You'll find your posse at the office you're going to go to and say, can you believe they said that again? But to be in the places where you need to be to get done the job that you see needs to be done, some of the stuff you're going to have to let go. And it's going to be really hard, and you're going to get mad at yourself for letting it go. But there are some fights you're going to have to fight, and the rest of them you're going to have to sort of say, I will save it. We'll save this fight for next time.
Yeah, I think sometimes you say things. I can tell y'all stories that would, like, your mouths would drop over. Some of the things that have happened to me in a newsroom by bosses. And, I remember once something happened at the Post. By the way, he hired me at the Post, just so y'all know. He did. He was the new city editor. And I was his first hire. And I don't know whether to thank you or I thank you for that. But some of the things that have happened really were, and my mother, I would call my mother and she'd say, do they still pay you every 2 weeks? And I go, yeah. She's like, take a sick day. So the next day I take a sick day, and then that's a work-life balance. That's why I left 1,000 hours on the table, because clearly I didn't take enough sick days at the Washington Post.
By the way, choosing battles is really smart. What makes it easier, a former anchor, a local anchor at the NBC affiliate here, Jim Vance, told me when I was very young, he said, you know what, you really want to go into journalism, you want to make a difference, become an editor, become a manager, become an executive producer, because then you're in the meetings where decisions get made, not only about stories and coverage, but also staff. I can't tell you how many people's jobs I saved at the Washington Post. Once. But it really makes that job a lot easier. So we're going to go into this next question. Amani is, okay, it just worked out this way. You're going first. So question is, there seems to be a lack of black and brown students in SMPA. I swear it's just a coincidence. If you were in control, how would you facilitate greater diversity, and do you feel connected to students of color in the SMPA? I can answer the last part for you. Well, I don't know whether you're connected, but I've had students in my classes when I asked them to write about a professor, like the plurality of them say they want to write about you.
About me?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Anyway. That's very kind, Keith. Thank you. I will say interesting because, you know, Professor Thompson and I started in the fall of 2013 together, and we really came in. One of my favorite stories is that I was at the PBS NewsHour, and I get a phone call from our like administrative assistant, and she was like, she's like, Imani, there's like a message for you. And I was like, why is it? We're like, what are you talking about? Like, just, forward it to my phone, and it was Professor Thompson. It was. Who was but like doing her investigative research about like who else is like joining this staff with me, right? This faculty with me, and it was a really amazing. Gwen Eiffel also was like, oh yeah, I know her, right? It was a beautiful moment. But when I think about what this institution means to me, and I will not speak for you. You remember that, yeah, right? And so what I think is really important is that I have been advocating and trying to advance the way in which Black people in particular, but BIPOC overall, have been seen in the School of Media and Public Affairs, all the way up to the provost level. And it's been incredibly intentional because when I came in with Professor Thompson, we were the only. There were no other full-time faculty members, black faculty members, and there was a very intentional movement to say, we, if I may speak for us, we want to make sure that we might be the first, but we're not the last, right? And so when I had the opportunity in 2020 to join Dr. Wasteboard as his associate director, not only was it an honor from my colleague, Dr. Karp, who was stepping aside for his family and personal reasons, but it was very much so intentional that I had the opportunity to then provide access to our adjunct faculty. And I said, okay, so how can we look at where are we? Why do we not see as many faculty of color? Why are we not recruiting the number of people that really look like not only our students, but what we would love to see our community? So it was an honor to, during that time period, to quadruple in that year the number of Black adjunct faculty members serving under Dr. Wasteboard. That was incredibly intentional. And so I brought in not only young alumni like Zincle Esemwa, who is currently at NBC Universal. I was able to be the chair of the committee that brought in Professor Holland here, and that was also, it was intentional. The university wanted to call these things like diversity hires, and I was like, they're not diversity hires. It's not a diversity hire. We're intentionally looking at the way in which our faculty mirrors our community and what we want to be. So those movements were intentional. they still are very integral to what I believe that SMPA fully stands for. So not only under Frank Sesno, but also under Dr. Wasteford. Like, there's an intentionality to make sure that all of us are seen. So it's intentional. It's not something that is left to the wayside. My colleagues, all of us are very passionate about our faculty, the individuals that we are able to bring into our community and what they represent, and we want them to look like not only ourselves, but we want to really bring in individuals that represent communities. So whether it be writing, video production, etc., it's an intentional movement. So I'm grateful to be a part of that, but I also feel like it's just something that was sort of destined to come, and I'm just grateful to be able to have someone to be there.
What about students?
The kiddies.
I'll just say quickly that I'm one of the people who I am here because of them and the work that they've done. I've only been here on campus for 3 years. This is the end of my third year. And the answer to the question is no, there are not enough students of color, black students at SMPA. Just the simple answer is no. And how do we solve it? We go out and find black students and recruit them to come to SMPA. When I was in the journalism school at the University of Mississippi at Ole Miss in the South in the 90s, and we had out of our journalism school, a full third of our journalism school was African American students, because Ole Miss made it a priority to go to public high schools in Mississippi and say, hey, if you're interested in storytelling, journalism is where you want to be. We want you. Sometimes all it takes is us telling somebody they're welcome. But we don't always do that. So if we want to increase the number of African American students, if we want to increase the number of male students in SMPA, if we want to increase the number of students of color in SMPA, we can't sit back and say to them, come to us. We need to go to them and say, we want you. We do that, but never hurts to do more of it.
I just want to preface very quickly that it is a priority of the current, I haven't met our new president, but the current Wright administration, it is a priority. I just want to preface that.
So a few years ago, we had a diversity committee in SMPA, which I chaired, and Adam was on the committee, and we came up with a set of rules and regs and things we wanted to do to bring in more students of color. Remember, we were going to go into the high schools, and somehow that stopped somewhere down the street, and it never happened. It wasn't COVID. They never carried. That's right. It just went away. I think another problem is the cost of this university keeps a lot of students of color out. I don't know how y'all afford it, or your parents afford it. Adam was, he was a Trachtenberg Scholar, full ride, which was great. Maybe we should have more of those. But because he's local, he's born and raised here. Posse scholarships, right? But it's really expensive for students of color, and a lot of them can't afford it. And those, so I watch my students, black, white, and otherwise. Some of them work like full time and take a full load just to go to college. That shouldn't happen. We should do a better job.
Let me add one. I promise you.
Wait. Let's get him first, and then we'll come back.
I promise you.
All right, faculty, cover your ears. No, I'm kidding. Agree with everything that's been said. I do think it's a recruitment challenge. I think the recruitment challenge that the entire university could face could then filter into the way that SMPA recruits black students. I will say that I was here that fall that the two of them joined, and we're the only. So to be joined on stage with four and the number of students who are in the audience is a vote of confidence. The more of us there are, like the more Devons there are, the more Zinclairs there are, the more Nanas there are. Like these are at the highest level. There are black SMPA alum that you can see and know that there's a space for you here. The other thing is, as a part of those recommendations, we thought about how can students who may be American Studies or Communications in Columbian or business school who wanted to be SMPA but didn't get in upon admission, how can they have SMPA experiences as they work their way up to maybe apply and enroll by the time they're a junior, which is why it was so valuable for me to have an experience like the Black Ace magazine. Other students choose the Hatchet, where they can have that journalistic experience and wet their chops and get experience that way. So I would really point to recruitment across the university. I think the last 10 years we've seen progress, but there's still more progress to see. But I would hope that as students in high school and students on campus, they can start to see that there is a place for them at SMPA just as much as SMPA makes an active effort to bring them in and to tell them that there's a place for them if they don't see it yet.
Yeah, the part about the cost is really key, I think, for me. We know that there's a wealth gap, and I think if there are more targeted funding opportunities for students of color in SMPA in order to pursue these unpaid internships and do them and not have to work an extra job on top of it, then I think it might be a more attractive choice for a lot of students of color on campus. So I think just trying to get at the fact that it's expensive anyway to come to the university, but then on top of that, to have to take unpaid internships in an industry where you need those internships in order to kind of break in at the start. I think that's a key kind of place that we should probably be looking more into at SMPA. But yeah.
There are these things called CAN scholarships. There are a number of opportunities. A lot of time we're seeing at SMPA, and because I serve on the committee that looks at scholarships, I mean, Steve Roberts isn't here right now, but he would be like, people need to apply. He would be screaming we just need students to apply. So we know it's hard. We're not trying to estimate the requirement that it costs to attend this university, but we do want to make sure that people know that there are resources available to them. And if you don't see those resources, please reach out to not only your professors here, but my colleagues here, your advisors who can also help you. But if you're wondering, I'm not sure, but there's also on our website opportunities and available for scholarships, resources to not only help you stay at GW, but also serve for your friends and colleagues who might want to come here. There are opportunities for them.
Just really quickly, we can tell as many people as we want to about SMPA and how great we think it is, but what's going to matter more is what the students in SMPA are telling their friends, their colleagues. The responsibility is on us to get more students here, but if the students who are here are telling people not to come here, you're going to counteract everything that we're doing. So I'm just really quickly saying, if you like being in SMPA, tell somebody. You're our best case study for other students like you to come to SMPA. When you go home, talk to your friends. If you want to be a journalist, SMPA is where you should be. We need your help to get more students like you here.
All right, for the next question, we're going to come back to you first. No. But I add one more thing. Add one thing to what Jesse just said, and that is, as you're spreading the word, you can tell people this. There was a recent study by a center at Georgetown University that looked at 850 bachelor's in journalism programs in this country. The top ranked in terms of return on investment was SMPA. Tell them that. If you have to go into journalism, your best return on investment is SMPA. And that's not GW saying it, that's Georgetown saying it. All right, so this next question, this right up your alley. How can we center, I love the phrasing in this, how can we center the black experience in journalism to make it more accessible and digestible for black engagement? That's kind of what you do, right?
I'm running through several different answers in my head to try to figure out which one I should actually say. We need more voices not only telling the story, but in the stories. One of the things that I made a habit of when I was in my final years at AP was making sure I found voices that we were not talking to in political stories. We always turn to Harvard and to Larry Sabato and to these normal voices. But why don't we call political science professors at Jackson State? Why don't we talk to the ones at Howard? They've been studying these same issues and no one asked them these questions. One of the things that we did that I absolutely love, and I'm trying to keep going, is that over the last year, we made an intentional effort here at GW to cover stories in Anacostia, which is a news desert here in Washington, D.C. Nobody ever bothers to go to Anacostia unless they're reporting about crime or they're talking about poverty. We're trying to change that. And it takes an intentional effort, especially in the current news environment where everything's cut down to the penny, to the half penny. It takes an intentional effort to talk to people who are not normally talked to cover areas that are not normally covered, because these are the stories that are going to be lost if we don't do this. So I think that it's not only worth the effort is almost required of us, those of us who don't want these stories lost, to make sure that we don't lose them.
I will yield my time to the advocate.
I'm going to yield my time to the current working journalist. No, do not.
Gosh, I need you to give me it again. Unless Adam, do you want to take it? Oh, I insist.
One thing to say, MSNBC does a really good job of having those voices. Yeah, they do.
Could you give it again? Sorry.
That's what I say, yeah. How can we center the black experience in journalism to make it more accessible and digestible for black engagement with news? Or maybe, so how do we get rid of that, me picking up a hard copy? Yes, I still get the Post delivered to my house. Picking up a hard copy of a Post, of the Washington Post, and seeing a story about some people I know and say, wow, the Post actually did a story about some black people.
When it's not about
When it's not about that.
and
That's really, I think that's the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just having a more diverse newsroom that can go out and find the stories that are not just about poverty and all of the bad things. I mean, obviously you need to cover those things, the bad things that plague the community, any community, but just having a diversity of voices and opinions so they can go out and have a diversity of stories. I think it's as simple as that. I don't know if I have an academic answer to the academic question, but that's good.
The next question's coming to you first.
Oh, really?
Yes, it is.
Okay, I'll quickly say I think larger institutions have done this so far so good with setting up black engagement verticals like Anscape, formerly The Undefeated, or NBC Black. Yeah, like well, yeah. So I think that's the point that we're at now. I would love to see that uptick where you can go to the front page of the Post and not the black news section or the equivalent in any given publication.
I was curious about Adam because he grew up over in a black neighborhood in D.C. and how you feel about it.
It's interesting. I grew up in a household that got the Washington Post delivered on the porch every morning. And in my household, the most important section wasn't arts, wasn't style, wasn't sports, it wasn't front page, it was Metro. We read the Metro section every morning. And it's it's interesting. How do I feel about it? I don't know how I feel about it. This was of all the questions, I found this one. I was happy that even just 30 seconds ago you broke it down with an example. So I was like, black centering black stories and black engagement. I was like, it's a heady one. Yeah.
I would say this too about that. Two things. One, by the way, no coincidence that I write for NBC, BLK, and Anscape, formerly the Undefeated. But here's the next question. So here's someone wants to know: can you offer some tips for students who are not in SMPA to get involved in journalism?
Of course, the Black Ace magazine, which I'm so proud still exists. Like join. I'm sure you know someone who knows someone who's involved with it. It's coming back. I've heard that it's come back this year. It kind of was gone for a little bit, so that's really exciting. The hash is there too if you want the institutional value. But I would also say that you want to get into journalism. You want to get into storytelling, communications. You'd be surprised at how I think this generation is naturally inclined to do some of the fact checking, right? Do some of the source growing and researching that is required of any good reporter, of any good communicator. You'd be surprised at how much you can learn just participating in active conversations on social media, right? The two-way street of social media, not merely posting about your favorite picture or your favorite topic, but engaging with others in discussion, engaging in the social media dialogue, to learn what it's like to rebut other perspectives, whether you become a columnist or you want to get your chops wet in terms of objectivity and being familiar with other perspectives.
We're gonna speed up. So we're close to the end. I think this might be our last question, and we'll try to get everybody to answer. Do your life experiences play into your research and reporting? If so, how do you think that helps your work? Let's start.
Do my life experiences play into my reporting? Yeah, I have a lot of common sense, and that helps me. That helps me a lot when I'm on stories, right? Like, I remember being on a story once. It was a guy who had killed someone, and he got away with it. And so I went to interview him because I figured out that he had done it. And I go over there with a photographer, and his phone rang, and he wasn't saying anything, and I'm standing there, and he's not saying anything, and then he hands the phone to me. And it was a relative of his, a female relative, who basically cursed me out and said, "Get out." So I said, "Well, I'm going to give the phone back to your nephew, because I thought if I stay on this phone, I'm going to give her what she's giving me, and I had to be professional." So I handed the phone back to him, and she says something else to him, and he's listening, and he hangs up, and he says, "I think you need to leave." And so I thought, okay, this is a guy who killed someone. He's probably got guns in the house. Don't be stupid, girl. It's just a story. Get out. So I said, not a problem. I said, "But will you walk me to the car?" So meanwhile, my photographer, Ricky Cariotti, who I love, tattooed up and down, he's with me. I turn around, Ricky is gone. Car engine started. He left me in that house so fast. And the reason I asked him to walk me out is because one of my cop sources, I had told him I was going there, and I asked for his advice, and he says, "Never turn your back on a killer." And so I backed out the house, but that was my common sense. So yes, that common sense plays a lot when you do investigative journalism, right? Because you want to come back.
By the way, how many of y'all heard common sense in that story? Anywhere. You're in the house with a killer. Where was the common sense in there?
Yeah, I think I kind of flicked to it earlier, but some of the identities, it's like remembering those when you're building your sourcing, when you're going and trying to figure out who to speak to. So like being gay, I cover a lot of sort of the anti-LGBTQ bills that have been going through the states in the last few years. And it's like remembering the groups that are big on these issues that can speak to them, remembering who the advocates are. And it's not so much that I work with them independent of my work at CNN, but it's like as a gay person, I'm aware of the kind of main players in this field. And so I think it's not so much life experience or life again, it's not like I'm like interacting with them otherwise, but it's like knowing based on my own identity who the players are in a certain space, and that helps my reporting.
I'm sorry, but I know that's actually, we are like out of time, and I know we could probably keep going. You all want to, one step, okay.
Use your passion to further your purpose. That's it. Use your passion. You all have so many amazing ideas and preferences. Use that. Trust yourselves.
That's a good place.
Okay. Well, thank you for having us here. Thank you for showing up. You want to say something?
Yeah, thank you all for coming, and thank you to all the wonderful panelists. This was a really amazing event. I feel like I got a wonderful insight by myself personally, so I'm so glad that everyone could be here. Before you all leave, if you could just scan that QR code to fill out the event survey for SMPA, and they're also in the back of the room. Professor Loge and Ways Board have them up, just so you can get an idea of how you guys learn about events like this and how to get you out to more of them. But yeah, with all that being said, thank you all so much for being a part of this, and thank you all for coming out, and have a good rest of your weekend. Not sure who this mic is to.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. It was fun.